Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the co-chairs and the organizers of the conference for inviting us to share our research. I'm happy to present our work on behalf of my co-investigators. So here's quickly our disclosures. The prevalence of chronic hepatitis C infections in correctional institutions tends to be higher than in the general population. For example, in Canada, the prevalence of the disease in the general population is less than 1%. However, in federal institutions, the prevalence of the disease is as high as 37%, and in provincial institutions, the prevalence ranges between 18 to 28%. Correctional Services Canada, which oversees the operations of all federal institutions across the country, uses a systematic opt-in screening approach. It is voluntary for all individuals upon initial processing and for the duration of their stay, whereas screening practices are more variable across the provincial institutions. So here's the cascade of care for Hep C again, and our study focused on this one part, specifically this step between antibody diagnosis and RNA testing. We can see that an absence from an individual's record of an RNA test indicates the absence of linkage to care. Without an RNA test, an individual can't really progress to the next stages of the cascade. To the best of our knowledge, no studies in Ontario have investigated data specific to RNA testing following antibody testing to determine the presence of active infection or clearance of the virus in incarcerated individuals. Furthermore, infectious disease surveillance reports released by Correctional Services Canada only include data on antibody positivity, not RNA positivity. So our study focused particularly on incarcerated individuals because they are a subpopulation of society that's at a higher risk for Hep C transmission. They've also been identified as a priority population for prevention and treatment. The specific objectives of our study were 1, to describe the individuals with a history of incarceration who have a positive antibody test, and 2, to compare the proportion of individuals incarcerated at least once who complete RNA testing between the correctional institutions and the community. We conducted a longitudinal retrospective cohort study using Public Health Ontario laboratory data collected from 1999 to 2014, containing information on all antibody and all RNA test results that were sent to PHO during this period of time. If at any time in the PHO database, an individual had an antibody test or an RNA test submitted from a correctional facility, they were included in our study as ever incarcerated. The tests didn't necessarily have to be the first ones, and they could have had a positive, negative, or undetermined test result. Just for interest, there were 12 federal and 39 provincial institutions in our database that submitted antibody and RNA tests during our study period. Here's a list of all 12. And 15 of the 39 provincial. Our primary exposure variable was the location from where the first positive antibody test was sent from, either the correctional facilities or the community, and our primary outcome variable was whether the RNA test was completed. Age, sex, and period of testing were covariates in our model. For our descriptive analyses, we used the chi-square test and the Kruskal-Wallis test. We evaluated our primary exposure variable along with our covariates, along with our primary outcome variable using a univariate and multivariate logistical regression. Now we will move on to the main results of the study. So approximately 1/3 of the 25,000 individuals that we classified as ever incarcerated had a positive antibody test, which is consistent with previous literature. When we divided the proportion of people with a positive test into the locations from where their first positive test was sent from, about 1/3 of our cohort had their first positive test sent from each of the 3 locations. 80% of our cohort were males. Median age at first positive antibody was 35, and there were equal numbers of positive tests in the database from both periods of testing. When we divide the cohort into the locations from where their first positive antibody test was submitted, we see differences between the locations in the proportion of males, the median age at first positive antibody, and the time period in which the test was submitted to our database. We found that 70% of our cohort completed an RNA test after the receipt of a positive antibody. The highest proportion of RNA testing was in those individuals who had their first positive antibody submitted from a community, followed by those individuals who had their first positive antibody submitted from a federal institution, and then the provincial. And this was confirmed when we ran the univariate analysis. In this model, individuals with the first positive antibody sent from the correctional facilities were less likely to complete RNA testing, and females were less likely to complete the testing than males. In the multivariate model, the association between location of first positive antibody and RNA testing remained significant after correction for age, sex, and period of testing. Again, the community was our reference, and we found that compared to it, individuals that completed the first positive antibody at the federal or provincial correctional facilities were less likely to complete RNA testing. In the multivariate model, we also saw an association with age, where each year increase in age was associated with decreased odds of RNA testing. So we can theorize that if these three variables are considered as a whole, then older women who first tested antibody positive in the provincial facility would have the lowest likelihood of completing RNA tests. In summary, our key finding was that first positive antibody tests submitted from correctional facilities were associated with decreased linkage to care. Specifically, there was a 45% reduction of odds of RNA testing in the federal institutions and an 83% reduction of odds in provincial institutions. There was also a sex difference in the linkage to care, with females being less likely to link than males. Future studies could investigate potential barriers that may exist for RNA testing within the correctional institutions. Identification of these barriers allows for programs to be put in place to mitigate them. Different strategies might need to be implemented at the two different levels of correctional facilities, as was reiterated before, because of the differing degrees of movement in regards to people within the two levels of facilities. And lastly, within correctional institutions, public health services have the opportunity to manage a significant proportion of Hep C cases in Canada. With higher rates of infectious disease testing and subsequent treatment, there could be a reduction of the burden of HCV in the correctional environment. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our partners in the various organizations, without whose work and support that our work wouldn't be possible. Thank you.
So I'll ask the obvious question. Would you care to speculate on why females are not getting tested as much as males?
I'm not an expert in this topic, but I think our study was done from 1999 to 2014. At that time, there was the perception that Hep C was more common in males, so maybe that's why females chose not to complete the testing.
Thanks for your presentation. Very nice data. I have two quick questions. One is, did you look at whether people got a second antibody test after a first antibody test? Because one of the problems is that sometimes people end up with multiple antibody tests and never get an RNA test. And the second question is, among those who did have an RNA test done, did you look at where it was done? So whether it was done in the prison, in follow-up outside of the community, and if so, who ordered that test?
So to answer your first question, in the database we did see there were many people who had multiple tests before following up with the RNA, and the tests again ranged in results. So someone could have had 3 positive antibodies before doing the RNA. For the purposes of our study, we just focused on the first positive antibody, and then that sort of answers your second question too. That no, we didn't look at the length between their first positive antibody and when they ordered the RNA, and also where they ordered the RNA, because we were just focused on the antibody test.
It might be interesting to look at whether serial positive antibodies actually was made you more or less likely to end up with an RNA test in the future. Thanks.
That's another question. Can I ask another one?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sal.
No one ever stopped me.
I know.
That's a really bad, awful thing to say. That was just a joke,
No.
by the way, that comment. Is there any way of, I presume part of the implication is that people incarcerated in provincial institutions have the lowest likelihood of actually getting treatment, because RNA testing might be the precursor to getting to. Is there any way of finding out from the admin databases linking to what percentages in federal and provincial institutions get treated?
I don't believe that information was in the database that we had, but I would speculate that yes, there are databases where there is linkage to care. There were some really interesting points brought up in the previous sessions specifically about provincial institutions. So we saw that they had the lowest likelihood of RNA testing. And we can speculate that one of the reasons that might be is because of the shorter duration of the sentences of individuals in provincial institutions. And the point of different tests were brought up, so either dried blood spots or saliva spots. So it would be interesting to see the effects of those tests and treatment uptake in provincial institutions.
Thank you very much.